our podcast, As to Be Frank, with your hosts, Aiden, Logan, and Izzy. And we have brought along a guest to talk about his experiences, Kyler Yu. Today we're going to be talking about the coronavirus disease, specifically COVID-19, and how it has affected people's daily lives. Coronaviruses are a group of related viruses that cause diseases in mammals and birds. In humans, coronaviruses cause respiratory tract infections that can range from mild to lethal. This virus has been with us since the beginning of 2019, but we were first evacuated from schools March 2020, and that's where discriminatory and racist events have started to occur, more so with the Asian and even more specifically Chinese population. Today we're going to talk about that. Logan, would you like to say anything?
My personal thoughts on this virus is that I did not expect for any of this to happen. I did not expect my school to shut down, and I did not expect to stay in my house for a year for education purposes.
Could we go into more detail about what happened the week during the school shutdowns and what your thought process was on that? What did you think was going to happen?
I personally thought that we would have came back by within 3 weeks due to spring break. And I was like, oh, this is just an extended break, right? But it turned out to be something a lot more larger in scale instead of just something we can kill off quick.
Yeah, now that we're almost, 2 years into this virus, it seems like our normal daily life, whereas back in those first weeks, we thought it was just going to be an extended spring break, and nobody really had any idea of the effects that it was going to bring to specific minorities, such as the racist hate crimes we've seen against a lot of Asian people relating the virus. Have you seen any of that, Izzy?
Oh, yeah. I feel like it's been around for a long time already. Like, just for Asian hate, and also, like, a lot of people seem to have, like, developed a lot of Asian hate during lockdown because, I felt that we were all isolated and no one really had, like, enough human interaction, that they've kind of lost their morals, and that they've not, like, they haven't had repercussions for, like, the things that they say, and there's, like, not enough education about it. So I feel like that's one thing.
Yeah, and in our ethnic studies class, we're taking 2022 at South San Francisco High School with Miss Dearborn. We have learned how people have been, specifically discriminated against with, slurs like, oh, you are going to give me coronavirus, or people assuming that COVID-19 is spread through Asian people. Have you personally seen any of that or heard of that through close relations?
I personally have seen a lot of discrimination around my school, around our campus, of the virus. We're like, oh, sometimes you'll see just somebody cough or like just drinking water. We're like, oh, you have COVID, and other things like that. I've gotten desensitized to them right now, but in retrospect, they're not socially acceptable in my eyes.
Oh, I want to add to that too. And I feel like that people have gotten so comfortable with, like, their Asian friends to say racist stuff like that. Like, oh, he has COVID, or like, oh, do you like eating cats and dogs? I feel like it's so normalized in our community at school, just because, like, we have a pretty big Asian population, and that we have a lot of Filipinos and Chinese people and, like, East Asians, that a lot of people just don't see anything wrong with saying something super racist to them and calling it a joke.
At this point, it's almost normalized. People don't see anything wrong with it, and it really affects people. I'm sure you've gone home before, thinking, oh, That really sucked. Why did they have to think of me like that? You know, I'm not carrying coronavirus. It's not my fault. And, you know, it's just a stereotype, and we're trying to bring more awareness to this. As a call to action, we've seen a lot of elders being specifically targeted. In class, we even learned that some elderly people have died from these hate crimes. Do you think that there's anything that we can personally do to help prevent that from happening and step up to the hate crimes?
I feel like it's definitely been brought to our attention ever since they started happening. But I feel like there hasn't been a lot done because I haven't really seen anything like huge investigations to actually find like perpetrators, and we haven't really gotten enough information to see like if there's any protection for Asian people. But like I feel like what we can do is maybe more policing. I feel like that will also be a problem because Asian communities will be over policed, and sometimes it can lead to like fake accusations against Asian people if we don't have like good police instead of like people who abuse their power as a police officer.
Yeah. At that same time, do you think, you know, these Asian populations are underrepresented by the police officers, not taken into account for these crimes that are going on, the higher rates of crime? And even the media isn't playing a big enough part in this to bring awareness?
I definitely think that these events that have been going on with all these hate crimes, I think what I've seen that have came out of this is that they're big enough to make they count as news headlines, but they're not big enough for an actual police investigation for it to go through. And I think that's awful because there's just people getting hurt over their race, and just because they're like, oh, they'll just be related to like COVID-19 and like, oh, do you eat bad soup? And then they'll like it's mostly elderly Asian people that are having to do a lot of this. And I think it's messed up, man. They're vulnerable, they're old, they're frail compared to everyone else. And the fact that we're not taking this topics more seriously in the media, I think that's awful.
Yeah, and, you know, these people, they're being killed. It's not even like it's a minor crime. It's murder. And as far as that goes, our guest, Kyler, would you like to say anything about personal experiences or anything you feel you relate to this?
Well, I've only like experienced one personal experience because like one time I was like walking at like the park and like some person walked by is like, oh, this is why like COVID is still happening. And it's like, it's kind of stupid to assume that like Asians are the one who started COVID because like it's not really our fault that it's spreading when there's other factors that can like take into COVID, like example, people not wearing masks or like people just not like really caring about anything that's going around them.
Yeah, when you have huge outbreaks happening from COVID-19, you know, in India, you don't see Indian people being discriminated against. It seems like it's localized, or it is localized just to these Asian communities. I'm sorry you had to experience that, Kyler. What do you think could be done to help or to prevent that type of thing from happening? Do you think awareness could be spread? How do you think that could be done?
I think people can like take action and like at least try and help other Asians because like we're like the ones being targeted, but like I don't think we really should be targeted when we're not really the only ones who are actually spreading COVID.
Yeah, and it's definitely false information, and it's just being spread around, especially by, you know, social media and some of the false statements we see coming from, for example, Trump's Twitter comments about COVID, where he calls it the Kung Flu and other various names, which feel very directed towards our Asian population. Fox News, lots of myths surrounding Asian Americans. How do you think that these news companies affect the way people think?
I think the biggest thing, I think it would be probably Trump's tweets and like his speeches, because he was the president at the time when COVID was a big thing and when lockdown started. And he would like tweet like, oh, Wuhan like virus or Kung Flu, basically mocking the name. And of course, he's the president. He has a whole bunch of supporters, so he would like egg them on to perpetuate like negative stereotypes about Asian Americans. And I think that's what started it, because like he would even make a bunch of comments like towards Asian Americans, and he would like dehumanize us, and like that even fueled the hatred even more. And like there was like a huge rise in hate crimes too, and like the myths about us like we're like contagious, and like that happened, and that made like a lot of people want to avoid Asian Americans.
What do you think the future looks like? Do you think people will continue thinking these ideologies, or do you think that we'll get it back on the right track and people will start to understand these views aren't true? A lot of this, as we've talked about, stems in social media portraying the wrong message. Do you think that things can be done to bring awareness to that?
Personally, I definitely believe that discrimination of like Asian people having COVID-19, I believe it will stay relevant because racism is very prevalent in the U.S. So I think it'll just stay as a topic. As long as people are still wearing masks, it will stay as a topic for racism against Asian communities.
Yeah, we've seen us in different communities. Hate crimes have been going up unprecedented amounts. Hate crime rates have gone up quite a lot in New York and San Francisco. And have you guys seen that increase personally?
I mean, I think so. I'm pretty sure there was like 1,900% increase, and that's like, if you think about it, that's like a huge number. If we had like, say, 2,000 hate crimes like a year before, that would be 3,800 like this year from the rise.
Yeah,
and in total that would be not just like not counting assaults, because also verbal hate crimes also exist, and online too.
even
Like
through
if
the
we're
hate,
all counting that would be a whole bunch.
even through the hate crimes that don't get reported, that's got to be a huge number too. Starting to wrap this up, you guys, there's definitely different perspectives from different Asian American ethnic groups. I'd like to specifically go through all your guys' experience. Logan, have you what's your overview, just experience of the whole thing being you, Logan?
My personal experience was not as severe as other people's would be, because I am, as someone who's part of the Filipino community, we were not as majority blamed as the Chinese community was for this virus. So I think my experience with this virus has been a lot more lighthearted compared to Izzy's or anyone else's who was in the Chinese community. But I feel like it still has affected us as a community wise. Or like we still get discriminated sometimes, even though we're not none of us are directly part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to add on, just because you are Filipino doesn't mean that you didn't go through as much, but your community has definitely experienced a lot of hate crimes because white people or racist, they don't really care about your ethnicity. What they care about is generalizing Asian Americans. So even you have slightly an East Asian feature, it's just Chinese. If they're not Chinese, someone could be Southeast Asian but they look Chinese. Oh, you're Chinese, right? And it's just they don't care about your ethnicity, They just want to find an excuse to be racist, towards Chinese people. So I feel that's a huge problem. Because, I feel even though they'll attack someone who's not Chinese, but will assume they are, that hurts the Chinese community too. Because their motive is because someone's Chinese.
Yeah, that's crazy. There's a lot of different experiences throughout all of the ethnicities, and channeling on from that, Kyler, how have you had similar experiences?
I can't really think of experience, but I can just think of all the reasons people just hate on Asians in general, because they think it's the only reason why it started, and they think that it's our fault that it's still going on. But again, there's so many other ways that we can prevent this besides just blaming Asians that they started it. People could take caution by wearing masks, or they could just not accuse people of doing something wrong when they could also be the problem too.
Yeah, definitely. I'd just like to go back and say that things we've learned today that we'd like to pass on to anybody listening to our show is, just because you're Asian doesn't mean you have coronavirus. That's been generalized, and it's sad. And you really need to be careful about what medias you listen to, because if you're just listening to one source, it's likely you're going to get an opinionated view. So do your research properly. Would you like to recap it all, Logan?
Exactly what do you want me to recap?
What have you learned that you'd like people to go through and say, I learned this from our podcast today?
I would like for people to figure from our podcast that Asian discrimination will still be active after everything around COVID-19 is over. I'm a strong believer that discrimination has always been active in America. It will still be active in California, even though we're one of the most widely accepted open states. And would you like to relate any of this back to our class topics, actually?
Yeah, in class we've learned how. I feel like in class we've only seen how Chinese people are specifically targeted and learned about Chinatown and everything that's gone in there, but it stems much wider than that. We've learned it's throughout all Asian communities, and possibly even out of Asian communities into different minorities. Racism is an endemic problem that will never really end, unfortunately, and our class has gone over that. I feel like it's very good to learn about that because it opens your eyes. Izzy, would you like to say anything?
There isn't much to say, but we've definitely learned a lot these past weeks about Asian hate and also how it's been around in the United States. But I definitely think that there will be someone or a group of people who will still hold or perpetuate Asian hate still. But we just have to educate and try to change their perspective.
If we can educate and change, one person's view on this, to me, that's a win. And that's what our class does well, is it goes over these things. It brings subjects that aren't generally given proper viewing, and it goes over them and teaches us things that we wouldn't have learned otherwise. Anyways,
Yep.
Kyler, would you like to say anything, as you haven't been in our class? You've just gone over this podcast with us. Anything that you've learned from what we've said today?
Yeah, I just learned that even though that like we aren't all like Chinese, that we still experience this, and that the president's opinion like actually really matters in this world, because Trump, he did point out that the virus was caused by the Chinese, and he has a ton of supporters. So that like also really sparked COVID, like how it sparked Asian hate.
And I'm Aiden.
And I'm Izzy.
I'm Logan.
This is Kyler. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to our podcast, As to Be Frank. We hope you learned something today, and we hope you pass it on.